we are encouraged to think that the world is coming apart at the seams. And we are presented with a solution which also is fraught with peril. And so we are encouraged to get focused on the things that are going wrong, right? I have actually found a series of vectors out of this that do suggest if we make the choice to change what we're doing and how we're doing it, reorganize society, do things in a different way, shrink our footprint down, there are ways out of this. And so the future doesn't have to be one of destruction and doom and gloom. Right. What I like to say is we're not, the system that we were born and bred to serve is dying, but we are not.
Right.
And if we've got the imagination to create something else, there are solutions on the books that we could use if we choose to look at them.
Hello and welcome to Capital Cosmos, everybody. Today we have a very special guest on the show that I've been stoked to have. It is Dr. Simon Michaux. Simon, thank you for coming on the show, my friend.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Awesome. Well, before we get started, though, I don't think we're going to be talking too much on the investment side, but if we do, nothing on the show is investment advice. Neither Simon or I are investment advisors, so please do your own due diligence. With that said, Simon, give us a little background of who you are, and where what you kind of study and research.
Right. Okay. So my formal basic training was a degree in physics and geology in Australia, then a bit of mining geology and geostatistics and open pit mechanics, then a PhD in mining engineering and blasting. I did 8 years in research and development in geometallurgy, and 18 years in the mining industry in Australia. And I left the research and development sector for a while and went to work at a private sector group called Ausenco, and supporting feasibility studies for a while. And then the mining industry crashed in Australia, and I left Australia to come to Europe in 2015 to Belgium to learn industrial recycling and sorting, and joined the University of Liège. And I was learning all about the circular economy then in its early form, which was hilarious. And then I came to Finland, where I am now, joined the Geological Survey of Finland to join their Mineral Intelligence Group, and since got promoted to the Circular Economy Solutions Group as an associate professor. So for the last 5 years, I suppose, I've been studying patterns in the mining industry, about patterns in the industrial sector, the mining industry, and everything it touches, and what is its needs, where's it going, what is it struggling with. And from there, I was also looking, is the circular economy, how are we going to do it? I found it was flawed and imbalanced. And then there was the green transition. And says, well, there was no feasibility study to show what we were to do. So I set about to actually map out what we were to do to phase out fossil fuels. As for the plan at the time, is this actually going to work? And the simple answer is no. And the bottleneck is in the commodities industry sector. Here we are today. And I've been thinking about how do we navigate out of these challenges? And there are a few answers there.
Fascinating. Before we get into what's looking ahead towards the future, you did mention to me off camera just a few minutes ago that you were able to kind of foresee the mining crash of 2012 through some of the feasibility studies that you were incorporating. Can you kind of take the audience through that?
Right. So when I left the University of Queensland, JKMRC, I joined Ausenco, and it was a very, very different world. The commercial world is very different to the academic world, and both of those worlds are different to the world I'm in now, which is government. So there are three worlds that interact loosely. So I was learning. I was in the commercial world learning how things work, and feasibility studies are all about making the case for, is a mining operation viable? And if the answer is no, then it has got to be put on ice, right? So I started attending seminars run by Westpac, which is a bank in Australia, that brought all the corporate investment groups together, and I could listen to their problems. And I sat up the back and I wasn't there to actually sort of make waves or say things or even promote my company at the time. I was there to learn, and so I was writing down furiously everything I could absorb, and I started to see patterns up on the board which were at cross purposes to what I was seeing at my professional job back at the engineering procurement company I was working with. And I actually saw a pattern that how a feasibility study is supposed to go together and everything, but the pressures engineering procurement companies are actually under from their clients: drop your costs or we're going to take our job somewhere else, right? The mining industry has been running for a long time like this, but the investment group was starting to collect information over the last or the prior 10, 15 years to show case studies how many times things went wrong. Like, when did you have a capex overrun? How many times? By how much? When did you have like a slow run up to production capacity? What they were collecting metrics to show that what was promised in the feasibility study and what happened at commissioning and what actually happened when the mine actually reached full production, and how different it all was. And they were collecting information to show that the investment community was deeply displeased with the mining engineering community, and there was a bit of a cowboy action, but it also showed how what we call a feasibility study would have to evolve in sophistication. And that was what we call geometallurgy at the time. We had to actually sort of do a more sophisticated study that actually, the study did actually resemble reality. And so all technological characterization methods had to be upgraded. And that's what's been happening over the last 10 years. So what I saw, in a long-winded way to answer your question, was the mining industry was about to hit a downturn, and we've just had the largest boom in history. So we're due for a bust, but it was the worst bust we've seen in a long time, if not ever. And I saw a list of operations that they were going to optimize by shutting down. But there was also a pattern back in about 2009. The Australian mining industry was selling iron ore to the Chinese government, and to make more money for their shareholders, the miners actually doubled their price, and that upset the Chinese government. But they needed the ore, so they accepted that. But when everything crashed in 2012, 2013, the large contracts that the Australians had been getting were not renewed, and they were sent to the Brazilians. And so the Brazilians, who had a cleaner ore, lower costs, right, and the Chinese also lent them a lot of money to build capital infrastructure. So the Australian mining industry found itself in a position where it was now competing with a mining frontier that had better quality ore, lower costs, and capital infrastructure they'd never be able to actually compete with. And so that was a structurally difficult, long-range prediction of the fate of the Australian mining industry. We'd had it too good for too long, is the simple answer. And the people trying to operate on that frontier finally, that had enough. And so the money left, and it went to South America. So when the commodities go, often hard rock mining goes with it as a general pattern, which is why for the last couple of years it's been a very difficult time in the Australian mining industry. And when I saw the writing on the wall, I actually decided to leave mining and go to industrial recycling for that reason. It was just going to be a difficult. I didn't speak Spanish. That was the decision. But yeah, so you see these large patterns, and you often find them in a bottom-up fashion, not a top-down fashion. Like, someone on the ground will see something, a strange data signature, and they'll match it up with something else, and then they'll see the big picture from underneath it. And so then they've got to hand that information up to someone at the top of the food chain, and then they, from the top down, have got to make a decision what to do. But the handshake between the top and the bottom just didn't exist.
So it was kind of left-handed to know what the right hand was doing. It's kind
pretty
of
much
that
pretty
way.
much. So. But you could still see it coming. Patterns like that can be seen from the bottom up and the top down, right? But information has to be collected in a way that has to be understood, and then it has to be put into the hands of people who know what to do with it. But then things happen by accident, and people sort of caught, and they just, how is this possible? So anyway, I didn't have the ability to make money out of that, and so a friend of mine who was a consultant. So yeah.
Well, what about now? Are you, are you invested in the mining space at all?
So I'm in the Geological Survey of Finland, and part of my contract is I'm not allowed to accept money from any other source.
Got it.
Right, I'm not allowed to accept consulting of any kind, and so that so you've got the integrity of of the position.
Understood.
So when I'm finished writing these reports, and there is a sequence, I do plan to leave my current position and go to another source so I can start generating a wage. So there is a chess match in progress that will go for the next the remainder of my career, which is about 25 years. Right.
Got
and
it.
so there's a series of chess matches that are actually sort of arranged.
Got it. So let's kind of look ahead. One of the centerpieces of your work that I've noticed is peak oil. Just like you kind of alluded to it, in your response before, that we've had it too good for far too long, right?
Yeah.
Does this
correct.
imply we've already hit peak oil, or we're close to hitting peak oil? And if so, when did we hit it, or when can we anticipate hitting it?
So the old story of peak oil, I think, has to evolve to include new things. So conventional crude oil, which is energy return, energy invested, like how much effort do we get back? How much energy do we get back for what we put in? Your conventional crude oil is much more effective than oil that we get from, say, the fracking sector. And so conventional oil actually peaked around 2005. And so we're not running out of oil. We've still got enormous amounts left of it. But all the cheap and easy and nice oil is gone.
Yeah.
So now we've got the expensive oil.
It's like you're squeezing the the toothpaste tube at the very bottom.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's
Takes
right.
more effort.
Yeah. Or the other one is if you're trying to actually drink a beer, but with a spoon. The first half of the cup goes great, but when you get down the bottom, it's still there, but you have to work harder to get it.
Yeah.
Anyway, so total oil production at the moment peaked in November 2018. Now, about 12 months later, we got hit with COVID, which then provided a lot of data artifacts. And so is that peak oil? Well, we're on track for world global liquids production to beat that record sometime in 2024. Right. But that total liquids now includes biofuels and gasoline that's actually made from other parts of the refinery gains, and we're building like massive inefficiencies into the oil industry that spent decades becoming very efficient.
So if I'm understanding this correctly, we have peaked in terms of energy return on energy invested.
I believe so, but unfortunately, the energy invested energy return tool has been corrupted. A series of papers have been published that I don't agree with. Like the maths to me is flawed and made some serious mistakes. But the whole idea of energy return on energy invested now, there's no agreement on how that calculation should be made. So it's almost to the point where it's not really useful as a tool to be part of. So what I'm getting at, though, is we have had a peak in the past. And since then, we've had all the trouble in the world. And so to get that energy, we're now having to spend a lot more money, and a lot more infrastructure, and a lot more capital investment upstream, and a lot more refining. And you may have noticed economically, things haven't gone so well for the last couple of years. And to keep it all together, we are expanding our money supply. We're printing money like there's no tomorrow, right? So that's sort of like camouflaging that basic problem. So what I would suggest is I actually believe peak oil is a couple of years in the past, but it actually doesn't matter because it's an era, not a point. Because you've got to think in terms of a system, a very large system, right? And how to say this? So you've got a very large system that interacts, and it takes time to respond, right? If we were to actually develop a post-fossil fuel system, it would take many years to build. Robert Hirsch released a report in, I think it's 2005. Well, the Hirsch report, it was actually published by the US Department of Energy, where if we were to find a replacement system for oil and to build a new system, it would take about 20 years to build. Right.
So, sorry, didn't mean to cut you off. Sorry, didn't mean to cut you off. But so oil, are you referring to just oil's utility as an energy source, or also like as a manufacturing source as well? Because how
The whole system, the whole system. It's in everything that we do at the moment, and it's so ubiquitous, it would take many years to build. And so we can't sort of wait for peak oil happens and then think about what happens next, right? If we did the proper job, we should have started back in, say, 2010. Maybe that would have been a sensible point to actually sort of transition off oil. And so what I'm just saying is peak oil was around now, perhaps a couple of years ago, right? But we haven't even started the plan to actually phase off fossil fuels, because my work is showing, first of all, that oil is becoming, unreliable as a market. It'll still be around. We still have a lot of oil, and we use it for everything, and we will continue to use it, as we will gas and coal, for many, many years. By simply because we simply haven't taken the time to actually make a new system. The alternative is to freeze to death in the dark. So we will proceed. But the plan to actually phase fossil fuels out involves what we call the green transition. Solar panels, wind turbines, hydropower, nuclear, electric vehicles, hydrogen fuel cells. So they're all the technology that we talk about. And so my work is showing that plan is much, much, much larger than current thinking allows for. Right? It's huge. And so we don't have the time, we don't have the money.
Yeah.
But
we're underestimating the entire problem.
The entire problem. And so, but when we actually get down to, let's say we did have the time and the money, the first bottleneck we hit is the industrial capacity of refineries and manufacturing that are all Chinese, really. But as large as they are, they're nowhere near large enough to deliver that much stuff that quickly. And then behind that is the mineral supply to supply those refineries is nowhere near enough, not even close, right? And so when you actually sort of look at like economic reserves as stated by the USGS at the moment, if you actually put that up against the amount of metals that I sort of calculated, all the battery metals like lithium, cobalt, graphite, vanadium, the current economic reserves in the ground represent about 2 or 3% of what's actually needed for the full volume to replace the system around us now, or as it was in 2018. And so it's not an efficiency step change that's going to save our bacon here. What's driving a lot of that is our need for stationary power, the buffer. Wind and solar are highly variable.
Right. Intermediate forms of energy.
Yeah. And so actually, it makes sense if I share my screen to actually show you a couple of charts. So this is the buffer. This is what a calculation called Net Zero America. This is what they've done. And so they've looked at, so it's actually quite a nice report if you actually have a look at it. So this chart on the right, you've got your production, but the solid line is the load demand. And sometimes day to day, demand exceeds supply, sometimes supply exceeds demand. And the times that supply exceeds demand, they're going to catch that, collect it, store it, and then release it, when the reverse happens in the day-night cycle and peak. And that's how they get to 5 to 7 hours, right? And so that's that job. What they have not done is accounted for, say, the long-term seasonal variations of, say, winter versus summer. In winter, the sun's not as good as in the summer, therefore production's less. But we've got to deliver a smooth, stable power grid supply. And at the moment, all renewable power systems are actually balanced off each other. So here's Europe in 2021. This is the electricity we've produced. There's Germany in the center. All networks are balanced and buffered by other networks. Like each country doesn't produce exactly the amount of energy it needs. It balances it. So
what do these arrows represent?
Okay, imports and exports.
Okay.
Right. So Germany, for example, when it actually has an arrow going, it's produced power and it's sent it out. So this 8.4 is produced by Germany and it's sent to Poland. But they send energy out and they bring it back into balance. Supply and demand must balance all the time, right? So, and usually it's the gas industry that actually does this, right? Supply and demand, power must balance supply and demand to, a millionth of a second, 50 hertz all the time. Otherwise, our electronics blow up. Blackouts and power spikes and what have you. And so they do that by power generation. With the gas industry, they can turn it on or off at any time, right? And so when
Right.
one power system is underproducing, they just get power from somewhere else.
Yeah.
So most existing renewable power grids are balanced with, say, gas. So the wind turbines in Denmark are balanced by power from Germany and Sweden, gas turbines. We've never had to run a large renewable network in a self-sufficient manner. Now, the energy mix for the future, as predicted by the IEA, wind and solar represent about 70% of the energy mix, and they are the primary energy supply going forward. So let's look at that. Here is solar radiance in Germany, 2015. Right, more sun, more solar radiance, more effective power. And you might notice the summer months produce more solar radiance than the winter months. Not rocket science, but so if this represented 35% of the global power grid, then we would have to flatten this out. And so it's about there. Okay. So all the power that's excess would have to be collected and stored and then released when it's below the line. And so the buffer needed would be that grey area that's gone in. The power buffer would need to collect power over about 6 months, store it for 6 months, and then release it slowly as winter happened.
So you might be ready. You might be getting ready to get into this, but does the material needed to create the storage capacity exist?
No, it doesn't.
Okay.
I was alluding to that, but that's where we're going.
Okay.
We don't have the technology, is the answer. All right, so there's 1 month. So I picked up a reference that had 28 days, and I've used that, and people have lost their minds. But that's 1 month against the grey. So that 28 days is not enough, not even close. I found another reference for 48 hours plus 10%, and 5 to 7 hours or 6 hours is that little red line there.
Mm-hmm.
Not going to work. So let's go to a case study of actual power. This is actually concentrated solar power in Spain, June and November, summer and winter. So this was the power that was actually produced. Now, if this was a standalone system, it's not. It's actually plugged into the grid and it's balanced by other things. It would be a 670 megawatt station. And the dark orange is what we would need for power buffer. So for November alone, and this is just 1 month, they would need 16.2 days of buffer capacity and store for 4 to 6 months.
So over half the month would have to come from storage.
That's right. So, and then wind. So that's solar. And I'm getting to a case study in America. So this is wind. So here's a wind meterage in November 2015. And that, look how variable this is. So if that dotted line was the flat line that service had to actually provide to, then imagine the buffer that would need to smooth that. That little red line is 6 hours of buffer. Right? 6 hours is not going to do it. 28 days probably won't do it. But I've just used 28 days because I found a reference for it.
Yeah.
Right. So this is actually wind from 5 countries stacked on top of each other. And the purpose of this is to show that when you're seeing like a lot of wind, it tends to be over a wide area. So you've got a wind peak in Germany, France, UK, and Denmark. Like you can't use, say, Germany to balance Denmark or Sweden to balance UK, because when one area has too much or too little wind, they all do. And the same problems with solar. When a solar station is not doing very well, it's because it's winter and the entire northern hemisphere is winter at the same time.
Yeah, it's highly unpredictable. You can't plan.
Yeah, and so we get variations of up to 48%, which is huge. So here's a case study from the United States that shows that it was done internally, an internal audit. So what they found is solar power underperformed by quite a lot 6 months of the year, and wind underperformed for 4 months of the year. Now, wind in particular is subject to weird weather anomalies. It could happen any time, but it happened this way for this particular year, and so they found that conceptually the idea that wind and solar underperform for months at a time is correct. And so this is the need for the buffer. And so, solar PV power produced power in 2018, 11.4% of the time. And the rest of the time it was idle.
Sorry, can you go back for a second? So the very bottom row there, blended renewables, monthly and annual capacity factors. What does that represent?
So that is all the renewables together that are blended in a weighted fashion.
Mm-hmm.
And so they've looked at monthly and annual capacity factors. So it's 32% of what capacity factor that's annual and for the month. Right. So it's at the end there, the purple is the annual, and then you got the months. So for the month of January and December, it was the renewables together were 33% of what it should have been. You know, so
Yeah.
yeah, and this is the weather. This is not, you know, no one's doing anything wrong here. It's just that's the weather, right? But we've been able to function like this perfectly fine because it's, you know, we've had fossil fuels to fall back on.
Yeah.
So then we actually sort of get out to, well, all right, so we need a big buffer, right? And that's our statement. We need a big buffer. And so I've looked at the power storage buffer, just wind and solar. Actually, the rest of the system needs a buffer as well in terms of switching, but wind and solar are highly independent. So let's look at that. Now, power storage buffer in the past, or up until now, is mostly pumped hydro, where you've got a hydro station, it collects water, pumps it up a hill to an upper reservoir off peak, and then during the following day, water comes back down the hill and then it collects it. Right, and then generates power that way.
Right.
So pumped hydro can be expanded. Now, there's a study going around that there's 530,000 potential pumped hydro sites worldwide where they're going to sort of dam it, and another one says 610. And when I started to look at this, the people around me gave me, smacked my fingers badly, saying this is politically unacceptable to actually take and rezone such a lot of area. It's not going to happen. But if the alternative is we're going to freeze to death in the dark, let's look at it. So, and you might notice Northern Europe has very little. So, but now, so the problem is how much fresh water will this tie up? So if you take the 28-day buffer and we need to hit our 2,000 or 28, we need 2,192 terawatts, 100 cubic meters of water a second. Let's say we break it up to that. 500 megawatt hours will need 360,000 cubic meters of water.
Wow.
And assuming an 81% efficiency for the system, we need 1.949 cubic kilometers of water. Now here's where it gets ugly. Global annual freshwater withdrawals in 2018 was a little under 4 trillion cubic meters, or 3,990 kilometers cubed, and that's graphically. So if we were to go pump hydro, the amount of fresh water it would tie up is about half of our global water withdrawals now. And the problem with that is we are at an unprecedented level of freshwater withdrawal. At the same time, the environment is deteriorating and there's water shortages all over the world now. So the idea of pump, yeah?
No, I was just going to say, I think the natural follow-up question is, do you foresee fresh water becoming a scarce commodity?
Yep.
In the future?
I do, but and for other reasons. But this is obviously, like pumped hydro obviously has its place. All systems have their place. We will use them all, but we won't do this. Pumped hydro is not our solution for our power. So, and so the Singapore government actually stopped share. We don't need that anymore. So the Singapore government did a study, and they shared it with me, that they believed that all stationary power storage needs will actually be batteries. And they were thinking in terms of 5 to 7 hours at the time. In fact, everyone is. But if we can't use pumped hydro, compressed air and spinning flywheels have engineering scale-up issues, but batteries can be put in any weather, in any footprint, right? And they're very flexible and they can be moved around at will. So our policy leaders think we're going to use batteries for that buffer. Now, wind and solar are not viable unless we can have that kind of buffer. because our electronics require stable power systems. And until we actually develop a system that actually can deliver that power buffer, wind and solar aren't really a solution. And to me, we don't have the technology to do that. So we've got to go back to the drawing board and think of another power system that'll deliver us our needs. Now, instead of everyone losing their mind and saying, no, that's not possible, can we at least talk about this, because there are solutions in that system?
What are some of the candidates that you see for
There are
alternative forms of energy?
So all existing plans for energy systems on the books at the moment have their bottle-up problems. Fossil fuels are going, and all replacement systems at the moment have some kind of logistical bottleneck, which makes them very difficult. Like the existing conventional nuclear industry cannot be expanded fast enough to be useful, and even if it did, it's so technically complicated that without fossil fuels, it's not really feasible to do. So one of these sectors has to evolve, and I found two. The first, geological survey, rocks are the answer. Of course they are. So deep drilling, geothermal is one sector. So I've actually seen one of these drills that you use electrodynamic fragmentation to break the rock with electricity. And if they do that, the drill bit never actually touches the rock, therefore it doesn't wear out and it doesn't catch. So you can actually drill very deeply, very quickly. And they're trying to actually commercialize that. Now, that's got its own problems. And it's even if that does work, you've got to get the heat up, and you've got to make sure there's no cracks and no joints that you're losing heat out of. But that could change, because there is an enormous amount of energy down at a depth of about 12 kilometers.
Can you explain what geothermal is to the audience?
Right. So the Earth core is very hot, right? And when you get down to a certain depth, you start sort of getting higher temperatures. And some parts of the Earth, these heat blooms are actually closer to the surface, right? Sometimes, the idea is you drill a hole in the crust down to the heat bloom, and two holes. You pump water down one hole, it turns to steam and goes through cracks, and it comes up the other hole. And as it comes up, you turn a turbine and you generate electricity. And in theory, once it's set up, it will always generate electricity. In reality, it wears out. The corrosion of the pipes means that the lining of the holes needs to be replaced fairly regularly. And so there's a lot of technical problems associated with that. But if someone does get it to work, then that's an enormous amount of energy. And with both of these systems that I'm talking about, it will involve a radical reorganization of society in industrial terms. The second system that I think is actually doable, because it's actually already been shown to work, is liquid fuel fission using thorium as the fuel. Now, if I may, this is, can you see that?
Yep.
Right, so this is a report written by Oak Ridge Laboratory in America, 1972. Right, this is actually the development of a molten salt breeder reactor. This system actually worked, right? And so what you've got here is it's an evolution of the nuclear industry. So instead of actually using solid fuel, like solid fuel uranium or even solid fuel thorium is not viable, because you've got to recycle it halfway through to clean the fuel, and that's not practical. This is liquid fuel, and it has a very different logistical footprint. Now, in the 70s, it was decided, or 60s actually, it was decided by the American government that they wanted a civilian uranium nuclear industry, because more jobs would be there, so more employment, more money was to be made. And the people who made this decision were military, and they wanted a civilian nuclear power system that would disguise the nuclear weapons production industry. And thorium is not really suitable for that. Now, so going through this, and this actually did blow my mind when I first saw it. I actually made this request to the Finnish government. Can you see that?
Yep.
Right. I wanted to actually look at the idea of actually looking at a feasibility study of this in Finland. And so it's all right, well, what are we talking about here? And so this is to actually look at something that's already been done, like, and can we do it here? So here is the uranium system. This is the existing system. So we're going to generate 10,000 gigawatt hours of electricity across a year. You start out with 123 million tons of ore and make 278 tons of yellow cake. You've then got to convert it and enrich it. What enriching it means is only one isotope in the uranium is useful for this. It's uranium-235, and that represents about 0.7% of all uranium. And the rest of it is uranium-238, and that's what we make bombs out of. So you've got to put it in a centrifuge and upgrade the uranium grade of uranium-235. We've got to enrich to about 4% to be useful. But that's the fuel. So only 4% in the nuclear fuel assembly rods is actually fuel, and the rest of it is waste. So we generate 10,000 gigawatt hours. And when it's done, we take the rods out. They're very radioactive and they're very hot. We've got about 30 tons of waste that requires very difficult handling, some of which 19 tons requires to be stored for 100,000 years. Now, a liquid fuel molten salt reactor, which, by the way, could use some of this as fuel, as it turns out. We're going to do the same thing. We take 1.45 tons of monazite sand. We make 1.34 tons of thorium fluoride salt, and we generate our electrical power 10,000 gigawatts. And about 1% of the fuel doesn't get burned up, and it's still radioactive, and you still need to take it out and do something with it. They're different isotopes, though, and they're normally associated with the medical industry. You know, cesium, xenon, strontium, all that. So if you're not going to repurpose it, which you could, but if you could store it for 300 years, and instead of like deep underground, because there's no gamma emitters here, a steel box lined with wax will do it. So for, say, the nation state of Finland, actually I've got that further on. Yeah, so we're talking about such a different footprint, and here the conventional uranium is radioactive all the way along, whereas only when you get to the waste in thorium that you've actually sort of got special handling requirements. And it's like handling isotopes at a hospital. So it's such a different footprint, it's almost not nuclear. Now,
no, go ahead.
Yeah, there's no reason why this won't work. And it turns out it's already worked. It's already been done. So let me just get through all this. Yeah,
so,
if the yes, yeah,
yeah, I was just going to say really quick. So we've had awareness of this type of process since about 50 years ago.
Yes, correct.
Yes. And so what's been stopping? I understand the rationale, behind the Western countries not adopting thorium molten salt reactors, but what about like countries outside of the West? Why have they not looked into?
They have. I'm about to show you a picture of a Chinese unit.
Got it.
And right. So if the little nation of Finland, right, consumes 85 terawatt hours in a year, we need 11.4 tons of thorium salt fuel, which could be made at any rare earth element mine site, which we have. Like Sweden's got enough rare earths for everyone. So one truckload of fuel goes in, and about 120 kilograms of waste would come out for a year for the nation of Finland. So a truckload goes in, and the mass of, say, a person, like I'm 110 kilograms, right? So a me is then put in storage. So now let's get to this. The top picture is a picture of the molten salt reactor in Oak Ridge. In that report that I just showed you, it went for 6,000 hours of stable power generation without incidents, right? And they shut it down. They decided, no, thorium, no, that's not what we want. We want the uranium system. The bottom picture is a modular 2 megawatt unit that's actually been developed in China. Now that looks like it fits in a shipping container. That would run a small town. And so in how that would operate is once a week, an operator would come up and they put a scoop of thorium salt in the top, and all the reactions that are radioactive would happen inside the shielded reactor. And every now and then the and the stuff would flow around the reactor, and eventually everything gets burned up until it can't, and then the stuff gets taken out by a trained operator. So stuff goes in, stuff comes out, and you don't need the footprint of such delicate and expensive people to do it. So so the idea was to do a feasibility study, and the Finnish government officials I talked to liked the idea, but they didn't give green light in the end. They said, yeah, we don't have the money, sorry. So we'll see about that. But the Chinese have already done it, and they've recently commercialized a full-scale thorium molten salt reactor. And it actually went up on YouTube. It was taken down pretty quick. And so there is actually quite a bit of pushback. Industries like the oil industry and the existing nuclear industry doesn't want to know about this. But so I'm actually looking at so many problems. Now I'm looking at a solution. And so how do we do this? I don't know.
Yeah. So this is something very elementary to you, but we've seen the chart where you have, since about the 1800s, where you see energy consumption by, wood, coal, oil, nat gas.
Oh yeah.
We never really replace a lesser dense form of energy for a higher dense. We just stack it on top of it. So from what I'm kind of gathering here, it seems like for the first time in through the ascent of man, is that we'll be kind of removing these lesser dense forms of energies for different forms of energy. Would that be the correct?
That's correct. That's correct. We are actually going to whether we like it or not, those systems will be standing down for one reason or another. They'll still exist, but they will not be able to bring so much energy to market for one reason or another. And so we are moving into an era of low energy availability. Now, it didn't have to be this way, but because there is a propensity across the board for this. Now, I've seen it many, many times. I've seen it in Europe. I've seen it in Australia. I even saw it in the United States, where there is pressure not to say anything negative. You said, "Oh no. You must give us a feel-good story. Don't tell us anything that will upset the punters. And if you do, make sure you fix it in the presentation. Present a solution." No one wants to hear about reality, and so we've got this situation that's very ideology-based. And now we're actually over our skis, and we've sort of hit this sort of wall of reality. What do we do? And but we're out of time, and we're out of money. What if we spent the last 10 years actually using all the money that we spent and consumed, actually starting to build the next step, whatever that is, and even talking about it, but they still won't talk about it. So it does my head in. Yes, still does. And so everyone's still living in like the 1950s in their head. And I suppose it's
because we're still, it hasn't really hit home yet. I mean, we still have, I have my AC running 24/7. It's 100 degrees outside. In the wintertime, I have my heat all the way up. So it's like, we're still living in a sea of energy. We take it for granted. But until we start having to ration things out, it's not going to fully hit home on the general population. So I guess, on your website, you mentioned that you kind of anticipate about 20 years to transition away from hydrocarbons, fossil fuels. Now, is that enough time?
Properly.
Huh?
No.
Oh, no. Okay. Well,
sorry, I interrupt you. Finish your question.
No, well, okay. So however long it takes to transition away from fossil fuels is the runway we have. Will fossil fuels give us enough runway to implement geothermal, thorium reactors and the likes? These solutions that you've kind of put forward.
So the answer to that question is actually more complicated than my flippant answer before. I think the best way to model this, and this may sound a little crazy, but is how does a jungle work? Like you've got, let's say, the Amazon jungle. It's made up of thousands of species, and conditions change, like a drought moves in, and some species that were dominant before don't do so well without enough water, and they start to die off. A minority species in that jungle does do okay in drought conditions, and it becomes it flourishes and it becomes dominant. And over time, species 2 will then take over, and species 1 doesn't die out, it just becomes less prominent. And at the end of the day, you've still got an Amazon jungle, but it's now made up of different species. So I think we're going to be looking at something like that. You've also got the idea of the jungle will shrink in the face of adversity and expand in the face of abundance. So, and that kind of thinking, I think, can be applied to our industrial systems. So what I mean by that is we will see pockets around the globe where people do actually sort of have a go. They'll implement a solution. Some solutions will fail, but some of them will do damn well. And the ones that do well, everything around that system will flourish. And the systems that don't do well, less so. The vast majority of people on the planet, though, are not interested in hearing any of these problems and are not interested in engaging in any of those solutions. So for that reason, the runway question is actually not valid, because they're not prepared to look at this. They want food brought to them in the supermarket. They want their favorite toys brought to them in the Amazon packets that arrive in the mail. They don't want to hear about we might have to change our whole system and how we live and why we do things, right? But some of us will. And so you'll see pockets all over the planet that will try, and like, for example, China seems to be aggressively pursuing the thorium molten salt reactor story. And I think they'll make a go of it, because you don't need water to cool this reactor, which means it's functional out in the desert areas where they don't have much water. It changes the rules. So India is doing the same thing. So the BRICS economies at large, I think, are doing quite well on a number of issues, and the West is determined not to look at other things, which means
I see.
I can see the West losing ground. And so what I'm sort of saying here is the future is non-linear. Some of it's here already, but it's not evenly distributed, and the solutions will be the same. They'll be non-linear, and they'll be pocketed up and all over the place, and it'll become apparent to everyone what works and what doesn't. And the people who find themselves in a area that's doing very poorly, it's up to them to sort it out and either do the same or make do.
So is that how you kind of see it? You see the West kind of having to take a back seat in the future just due to the fact that they haven't really taken this issue seriously, whereas the BRICS countries are paying more attention to this resource scarcity, and they're actually trying to tackle the issue there. So you mentioned China, you mentioned India. Any other countries that you see?
So Russia. So I'm actually finding you where is it? Do I have it? Okay, that's come up. So I've actually made a map. My work is to actually track data patterns. Right, can you see that?
Yep.
This is a map of large events that are actually sort of happening, that are happening to make sense of what's. I believe the West had a macro scale plan, and that plan is falling over, and we haven't really stepped up to replace the plan of such bold vision. I've incorporated a series of events over time, where you've got the Bretton Woods Agreement back in 1944, mixed in with the petrodollar agreement, the metal price blow, which I found for 2005, which I believe is the signature when it actually everything started to come apart. But along the axis here, we've got the four turnings. The book, The Fourth Turning. Right. So these are the four turnings. And so in 2008, we had the global financial crisis. That actually started in 2005 with the metal price blowout. That put the system under such strain, but it's when things broke is what we saw. And we fixed it by printing money. And in fact, it might make sense to show you that.
This is the first time I've ever seen that connection before, actually. Yes.
Okay. So this is the World Bank basket of metals price and crude oil price index. This is to show that metals do correlate with oil in particular. So we're a petroleum-driven society. So what I did these were the metal price in monthly resolution back to 1960, January. for aluminium, iron ore, copper, lead, tin, nickel, zinc, gold, platinum, silver, and the energies of oil, gas, and coal. This is the basket of commodities that the World Bank uses to track the health of the global economy. What I've done here is taken those numbers and I've indexed them all to the number 100 and December 2001, which is over here.
Mm-hmm.
What that does is takes all those prices and overlay them, and you can see periods of relative stability. So that happened in January 2005. We had a blowout, and it happened in January 2005, which I think is linked to the oil industry. But the prices went up, and they all blew out. And then we had the global financial crisis, which we fixed with quantitative easing. But whatever this is, it didn't fix the volatility.
Yeah.
And so whatever it is, it's still there. And so, yeah, I need to update this chart now. It's now 18 years ago.
So it looks like on the right half there, the prices are still, I mean, you had a big blow off top, but then the prices are still elevated relative to like
yes, they are.
2005.
Yes, they are. So I've got like a trinity. You've got money, you've got raw materials, and you've got energy, and they're all linked. You can't have one without the other two. Here's another one. So there's the same data, but now I've linked January 1970 to the number 100, which is that point there. When we actually decoupled from the gold standard, the US dollar decoupled from the gold standard. What do you think is going to happen?
It's going to go up.
Boom!
There it is. Put it lightly.
So we've actually got two points in our financial system. The first one was 1970, and we started to hemorrhage. And every now and then the system tried to correct itself, but we wouldn't allow it to correct. And so we kept, this is the old idea of the moral hazard. We stepped in and kept changing things to make sure that good times stayed. And what we've done is essentially guaranteed our destruction. So what happened in 2005? Oil plateaued.
Mm-hmm.
So here's our conventional oil. Tar sands and fracking did exist, but they were much, much smaller than they are today. And so oil supply was not able to expand, and it plateaued, yet demand continued to increase. Now, the swing producers at the time were the Saudi Arabians, and they were told, increase your production. It turns out they couldn't. The reason I say that is the chart on the right is rig count. On land is the dark grey and the blue is offshore. They were bringing on more and more rigs to drill more and more oil. But in that time, they had a 146% increase in rig count in exchange for a 4% contraction. Look at that, 4%.
Yep.
Right. So the Saudis were told to bring more oil onto market. They couldn't. I actually got the impression that they have been sweating their asset ever since, and they actually hit peak oil. The Gawa deposit in particular.
It looks like it happened around 2006, 2007. And
so this is the January 2005 marker. So they just brought more rigs online, and they started actually sweating more and more stuff out to force production. So here is supply and demand for oil. Mm-hmm. It's now very difficult to get such a chart. Usually they put biofuels in it, so demand never overlays with supply, and it never really sort of lines up. But this is actually one where you've actually got crude and energy. Mm-hmm. So you have our plateau there, and here's our oil price at the time. There's our plateau. Right. And you've got a period of time supply and demand did actually separate. Yep. And in that time, we've got our price spike. So speculation did actually.
Interesting. You see the lag there as well. Like you see a little bit of a lag between the maximum delta between supply and demand, and then like a few months later or a year later or so, you saw the spike in price.
Yep. And so there's a global financial crisis, and the marker was the oil price. That's what's up. Can't do it anymore. And we fixed it with quantitative easing. Right. So, and then fracking, horizontal, an evolution of horizontal drilling in the fracking industry happened. And then things took off, and now all oil growth, or 96% of the growth in the oil industry, has happened in the tight oil frontier of the United States. So a case can be made that the global financial crisis was caused by a chain reaction with its genesis in the oil industry. We resolved it with printing of money. Fracking saved our bacon. And the United States is now the global swing producer, with the majority of growth coming from tight oil.
So I know you said we don't have any data post 2015 because of the addition of biofuels kind of mucking things up there, but it seems like the conditions are kind of being replicated today, are they not? Like, does that imply that we could see like another GFC style event?
I would say that is the case. I would say we've got other, geopolitical pressures. They're printing money like there's no tomorrow. All central banks are doing it. It's getting ridiculous. And so you've got this trinity of money in one corner, which are all fiat currencies, and now you've got the commodities and the energy. So if we go back to that chart, so I'm making the case that we're seeing something that was triggered in the oil industry. Because oil is in everything that we do. It put everything else under such pressure. The prices went up. The system couldn't take it. The weakest link broke, which the subprime mortgage industry in the United States was blamed. But to me, they're just the weakest link, the dodgiest link.
Yeah,
the whole system was under pressure, and we had our crash, and we fixed it with the old Band-Aid on a bullet wound, and it's still there. So the problems are still there. Here we are, 13, 14 years later, and we're in the same position, and now everyone's needing, and banks are failing again. Only this time we can't print our way out. So this is why. Okay, so this is GDP, gross domestic product, for the year 2018, and total liquid consumption, which is gasoline, but it's come from all sectors, including biofuels, and they're now making fuel out of the gas industry as well, which is why they're masking peak oil. But this chart shows we've got a problem, right? High oil consumption, high GDP, low oil consumption, low GDP. This is from Art Berman. He did from Labyrinth.
You've got a 92% R squared. I mean, a 0.92 R squared value. So I mean, that's almost as good as it gets.
So there is the big European economies. Europe is the blue. United States, and there's the BRICS economies. These larger economies may well struggle to stay economies in a low energy environment with not much money. You might see these larger economies try to balkanize because they just won't be able to function. So, so check this out. So this again is from Art. Art, if you're listening, thank you. You do excellent work. You make my job so much easier. So, anyway, so this is total liquids production. And so you got our peak in November 2018, right? And then we got COVID, the gift that keeps on giving. By the way, is COVID over? Is it over? We're about to go again? What? No one can give me a straight answer. So, but anyway, so at the time, this was May 2022, we were on track for it to actually override this peak. Whether that happens or not remains to be seen, because we're running out of money and all that. But let's unpack this. Same data, but now it's actually put together by source. So the blue is oil, crude oil, and there's our possible peak there, and that's not coming back. But the rest is now coming from biofuels and natural gas derived from and so this is our it's a refinery gains thing. So we're building, it's not smart. We're building a deep inefficiency into the oil market that was efficient. Now, what that tells me is even if we do beat that peak, the fossil fuels industry, oil and gas in particular, are struggling to keep up.
Yeah.
So in a system that mathematically has to grow, it can't grow. Therefore,
sorry, didn't mean to interrupt. But so is this the reason why we've got like $80 oil price, but then we've still got a $3.50 price at the pump in gasoline? And some people attribute that to just corporate greed or something along those lines. But it's really just due to the fact that the oil is less of a share of gasoline production than it once was. So there's not
So
like it's a one-to-one mapping.
not anymore.
Yeah.
Not anymore. So you've got column A and column B. Corporate greed's definitely part of it. But you've also got a lot of geopolitical influences. The most commonly traded derivative market on the planet, as I understand, is the oils market in derivatives.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of the derivatives is tied to this as well. And so that things like that have an influence on price. Right.
Right.
So this next slide, gas, people who normally argue with each other. So I'm in Europe, and we've got the mess in Ukraine dealing with, and
Mm-hmm.
the Russian gas has been cut off, and we're in a world of hurt. But so this slide generally gets people who normally argue with each other don't argue anymore. So gas supply, and so these numbers need to be updated because the new set has just come out. But the biggest producers are there, right? But the biggest producers also happen to be the biggest consumers. So 4 countries dominate the natural gas market: the United States, Russia, China, and Iran. And those 4, dominate the production, consumption, and reserves.
Right.
So there's consumption. The net import-export looks like that. How much can they actually bring to the market? So if we were to actually reorder that table in terms of net export, it would look like that. Russia's at the top of that chart by a long way. It's
Right. So
bringing more gas to the market than anyone else.
yeah, so they're producing more than they're consuming, essentially, is what this table is telling us.
Yeah. And so they could sell to everyone else.
Mm-hmm.
So Russia was bringing that to the market. Europe, as you can see, is a big net need. So Europe needs 352 billion cubic meters net. Right, so it's producing some, but its net is bad. The next worst net is China with all their industry.
Mm-hmm.
Right, they need 169, and Europe, look how much worse that is. That's domestic consumption right there. So if we put Qatar, Norway, and the United States together, we can only just hit that target. But to do it, they would have to wipe out all existing contracts. Right, so the Russian gas just can't be replaced. The market doesn't have the capacity to do that. Someone has to go without. And the idea that Europe can actually get all its gas needs from the United States at 107.5 net billion cubic meters a year, sorry. And whatever comes down this pipeline that goes from Norway to Poland, when they blew up the Nord Stream pipeline, a day later, the pipeline from Poland to Norway opens, and they say, we don't need the Russians anymore. Right, whatever comes down that pipeline is not going to be enough for Europe. And whatever does come down that pipeline has to be taken away from the United Kingdom, which is where the gas is going to now. So Europe is now in a conflict that has no acceptable outcome. And what I think is happening here is Russia's attempting to do what the United States did in 1973, where the petrodollar agreement was all oil was to be bought in US dollars, right? Globally, that's it. And the whole problem with the Ukraine war, which I think it's really about, is forcing Europe to use the ruble, which is now a partially commodity-backed asset, buy gas. If they were prepared to use rubles, this could be problem solved overnight. But they can't do that. Because if they allow that to happen, then the ruble, which is not a fiat currency anymore, would expose all the fiat currencies and all the debt associated with it. And that would set off a financial nuclear explosion, which the system could not tolerate. So I think the reason for the war and why it's been going so long is the Russians are trying to force the West into a position where it allows its currency to survive. But the West cannot allow that to happen because then their currency will be destroyed.
Right.
Because we're in a fiat currency. So there are no good guys here. And so that's what I think is happening there. Then I made this map. So I'm jumping around here. I'm trying to keep it consistent. I made this map to understand what the hell we're looking at.
Mm-hmm.
So up here, we've got the Bretton Woods Agreement where the US dollars is gold backed and it becomes the world currency. At the time, the US was half the world's GDP and they had most of the gold anyway. It made sense. And, they were the oil pump of the world. So, yeah, fair enough. Peak oil discoveries in 1962. They decoupled from the gold standard in 72 because they mismanaged the situation. They were printing more dollars and they couldn't back that up with the gold reserves they had, and so the French basically demanded their gold back, and then they said, no, we can't do that, so we're insolvent. So that was the petrodollar agreement. Happened a year later, where all oil contracts.
Yep.
And so we had
we went from a gold-backed currency to a gunboat currency.
Yes. So then we got the metal price blowout in 2005, which later caused the global financial crisis. The petrodollar falls. I believe that's the point petrodollar actually fell. And we've been printing money now to patch it all together. So, and in fact, actually, what makes sense is if I make this, the number of times we've gone to war in the last, here we go. No, this is actually my oil report, which is not, I actually wrote it before I actually sort of was known here. This is actually explains the last 39 years. Right, so what we've got in a column on the right are countries that have gone to war in an area where there's oil. Columns on the left is where the battlefield or the subject of the tensions actually are. So we've got the battlefields, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, and then economic sanctions, Iran, Venezuela, and Russia. The column on the right are all one alliance, and they're all peak oil literate. They've all sort of done reports and then kept them confidential.
Okay.
And so both the recipients and the aggressors have reserves, production, and consumption. Like the recipients have got 44% reserves, but the aggressors have got 37%.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not clear cut. So who controls the oil market? So this, right, and so there are countries that are represented here. The 10 countries shown represent 77% of reserves, 64% of production, but only 48% of consumption. So a case can be made that the conflicts, military and economic, shown on the figure, can be seen as a contest in who controls the oil market as the market approaches peak oil. It is beyond the scope of blah, 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 blah. All right, so we haven't really had many conflicts about oil in the last couple of years. Prior to 2018, they were all over the place. There was Iran, there was Iraq, the Syria, that was gas pipeline. It was all about that. But since then, it's all gone quiet. Peak oil's happened. We now know who controls the market, and now we're on the downslope. And so I found that pattern. Now we've got this map here. So we've got this period from about, I don't know, around 2000. In fact, from September 11 onwards, we've had resource wars in areas where there happened to be oil. But it all cleared up and went quiet in the late 2010s. We've even pulled out of Afghanistan. We don't care anymore. Right. So peak oil production, was 2018 really peak oil? Who knows? But to me, it's around now, and it's going to be such a lot of difficulty to actually try and deal with this. Right. So it doesn't matter what the actual date is. If we can pin it into a 10-year window, that's all the precision we need.
Yeah.
So then there was the idea, there comes a point when the number of gas reserves that have already been discovered, that peaks, and then we'll start to decline. Production's still going up. We've got plenty of gas. We've got COVID-19. Now, just as the price was about to close, the market was going to close, supplying, I had this contracting window, and just as the window was going to contract, COVID happened, and that's masked the effect of peak oil. We were about to find out, and now we can't. So now I think we've got the genesis of a gold-backed ruble and yuan currencies. Now, I made this about 4 or 5 years ago. So this is a little bit wrong, but that's now on the books. So this is the Commodities Alliance, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. But now you've got about 30 other countries wanting to join the same alliance. And it's all about commodities. Yeah. So they're going to have a currency or a currency system based on commodities. And so we've got conflict. This empire is crashing. Like the United States is an empire. You've got 1,000 military bases around the world. You've got the world currency. They've been throwing their weight around economically, blah, blah, blah. So it's a kind of empire, right?
I
And
see.
that empire. Hmm?
No, I was just gonna say I see you put in the Thucydides trap in there as well.
Yeah.
Do you think that'll actually play out?
So the Thucydides trap is: do we go to war or not? Now,
Mhm.
the Thucydides trap, the book itself, right, is about the pressures involved, where you have one empire that's established and a
Right.
new rising power that could become an empire that scares the hell out of the first empire. And the fear inspired in the first empire is what causes the war.
Yeah, because
But
they've got
in
to
18,
act because they're at their strongest at this very point, and their
yeah,
opponent's at their weakest because it's only going downhill for the aggressor and going uphill for the new kid on the block.
and so they've got to work out what to do here. So the BRICS economies, they have terrible internal problems as well. It's not all swings and roundabouts for them. And so this is not a clean cut set of ideas. Like whether China stays China, that's an interesting question. But of the 18 case studies, 12 of them went to war, 6 did not. Right. So these pressures were brought in, but they were resolved. How were they resolved? And are we doing those things? Turns out, no, it's not, because the West in particular has been very aggressive in its actions. It's almost like it wants a war, and that war will be camouflage for the transition to whatever system they've got planned. But now that the petrodollar has fallen, why are we seeing the Ukraine problems now? Why didn't we see them 5 years ago? Because they've been shelling, the Ukrainian nationals have been
Donbass,
shelling Russian civilians in the Donbass since 2014. Why do we see it now? So I think that's actually part of a wider strategy. And so if peak oil really is 2018, all producers would know the status of their reserves and production, especially if they're in an alliance. They would have told each other. And so the whole, the triangle, you've got on one corner, you've got money, currencies. The other currency, you've got raw commodities like metals, and then you've got energy, and they're all the same. And they would know that they're heading towards a flashpoint. And once you hit peak oil, all energy resources would have to be renegotiated. But that would be a breach of international contract law. So if the West could be convinced to break international contract law first, that would suit the Russians just fine. So the Russians actually move into Ukraine. What do? We hit them with economic sanctions the day after. Those economic sanctions are a breach of international contract law. So the Russians then can say, okay, the gas deal has now changed without compromising anything else. We were punked by the Russians. And the Russians are not interested in finishing the war anytime soon, because their true objective is to force us to comply. And until we do, the war will continue. And it's not about Ukraine at all.
Yeah.
The poor people in Ukraine, oh my goodness. Anyway, so here we are at 2023. The Basel III banking accord goes live this year. And I don't believe it's a coincidence that we're seeing the most extreme economic signatures for a crash ever now. Because, the Basel III banking accord, it will formally recognize gold and some commodities as valid bank reserves, which is the basis of a commodities-backed currency set. So you've got the fiat currencies that are in trouble and a commodity stuff that's trying to manifest, and we're seeing a lot of geopolitical actions to stop it.
Right. But don't you think this will take a while to play out, the transition from the dollar as the world reserve currency to a commodity-backed currency, right? Like,
no one knows the future.
Yeah.
So these are just sort of ideas of, pressures and influences. On one hand, our systems are virtual, which means change could happen overnight. On the other hand, these issues have been around for decades, right? And they've been bubbling along for decades in the background. Right. Now, so they're openly talking about now, like the CDCIC cryptocurrency, WorldCoin, or whatever.
CBDC. Yeah.
Yeah, they're talking about the Great Reset.
Yeah.
What is that? Oh, that's when all fiat currencies default and the banks now own everything. What sort of society will
with
it
a
be?
Programmable currency that they can, influence purchasing habits and consumption habits.
If we're in a low energy world, we don't have that much energy. Fossil fuels are on the way out, and the green transition is not really feasible. How does a small number of people keep a large number of people in place to accept crushing food shortages and disgraceful poverty?
Yeah.
When it comes out that these problems were known decades ago and our leaders did nothing, how do they actually control the population then?
Well, it also gives them the excuse to actually implement it to begin with. So it's kind of like, if you want to get really, if you want to get really conspiratorial with it, like, maybe we're not looking for a solution for a reason. So then we can actually implement these draconian currencies, these draconian surveillance grids.
To me, this is the plan, and it's not a conspiracy theory. The World Economic Forum have openly stated this is what they want to do.
Yep.
What's also happening in the background, Europe has a plan, circular economy, where we talk in circles. The United States has a plan, but China has a plan. Now, this started around 2003, as far as I can tell, and its inception point is 2049. And by 2049, they want to control everything on planet Earth industrially. They want to own, control outright all industrial actions of note, and they want design of the technology. This is why they're actually fighting over the semiconductor industry at the moment, and that's why Taiwan is such an interesting flashpoint. They want control of the semiconductor industry to design. Now, the current there's a report out there called Made in China 2025, where someone's actually gone out and mapped all this, where the outcome is if you want to buy anything industrial, like if you want to buy a car or a computer, you will do business with the Chinese in some fashion. They already control about 60 or 70% of the industrial ecosystem as it stands at the moment. They're mining, smelting, refining, manufacturing, and even recycling. They're moving across the planet with capital investment to get controlling shares in industrial things like ports and power stations and bridges. Why? Train tracks. In the background, they have had a plan.
Yeah.
So, and so that's quite. It's quite clear. That's where things are going. Whether it works out or not, I don't know, because they've got some remarkable internal problems. And in the background, we've got the social problems of the fourth turning. Like we're in the fourth turning now.
Yeah, this is a very highly complex system. To be able to, it's one thing to have a plan, like you alluded to. I follow everything that you're posting here, but it's another thing to actually execute on that plan. And there's a predicted value and the actual value, and the question is, how much is their error in judgment going to be in actually executing this?
Remember the Trans-Pacific Partnership?
Yeah.
TPP. Right. There was actually three: TTP, TTIP, and the TISA.
Okay.
There were corporate agreements between the large corporations of the world and the United States government. That was to be a replacement for the petrodollar.
Mm-hmm.
But in 2008, around here, when we saw the GFC, I'm going to put this in here. Oh, there it is. Plan A failed. The petrodollar replacement, TTP, TTIP. Right. So it failed. When people understood what that actually meant, that would essentially set up a new petrodollar system where the United States would continue to be the center of the world, and all wealth will be harvested from everyone and sent to the United States. China would like to do the same thing. It's the same idea. And none of us like it because the future has to be decentralized.
Yep. And then, which would be an anomaly given the trend, because the trend has been decentralization throughout human civilization. We become more and more decentralized. What's that?
So World War II, right? We had lots of nation states, but after World War II, everything was more centralized. We had like the formation of the European Union. So many people are now going to one point. As we have gone along, like, for example, what is the influence of companies like Google or Alphabet that owns Google? So much information is flowing to one point. So for the last 50 to 100 years, there have been a number of structures that are centralizing control, like the idea of a world coin, like a world currency.
Mm-hmm.
I, from an energy point of view, that is counterintuitive and won't work. So all the hopes and dreams that they might have, I don't believe will. They might roll them out, but they won't last very long. I can see it all fragmenting, and we're going back to a more decentralized set of nets.
Yeah. Well, this has been extremely fascinating, Simon. If you don't mind sending me this document here,
I can do
this
that.
is very eye-opening. But fantastic work on just collecting all of this data and information and just kind of coalescing it into a framework that's digestible. I really appreciate the level of detail and granularity that you just meticulously go through all these different levels here.
Oh, it's been coming together for a long time, so it's not. Yeah. Thank you. But remember, I've only got a small number of these things together. It's not. Don't think for a moment that I've got all the answers.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, we all have pockets of or just what do they call it? Pearls of wisdom. It's kind of when you put them all together, you kind of see a better picture.
So
We all have our
I've just
maps
sent
of
you an
reality.
email. I've just sent you an email. Just confirm that you got it, and you should have 3 PDFs that come with it.
Excellent. Yeah, it should come in any second now. But any last parting thoughts to the audience?
Yes.
Sign off?
We are encouraged to think. We are encouraged to think that the world is coming apart at the seams, and we are presented with a solution which also is fraught with peril. And so we are encouraged to get focused on the things that are going wrong. Right? I have actually found a series of vectors out of this that do suggest if we make the choice to change what we're doing and how we're doing it, reorganize society, do things in a different way, shrink our footprint down, there are ways out of this. And so the future doesn't have to be one of destruction and doom and gloom, right? What I like to say is we're not, the system that we were born and bred to serve is dying, but we are not.
Right.
And if we've got the imagination to create something else, there are solutions on the books that we could use if we choose to look at them.
Yep, the system is there to serve us, not the other way around.
Yeah,
and we can architect the system that works best for us.
All tribes of doom and all tribes of cornucopia seem to think I've got a foot in their camp, but actually I'm navigating a path through all of it, and I'm taking off in a direction that is different to what everyone else seems to think.
Yep. Awesome stuff. Well, if you guys enjoyed this video, I know I did. I'm going to have to rewatch a lot of this stuff again because it's very dense stuff. But if you enjoyed this video, go ahead and give us a like, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Leave us a comment down below. Do you agree with everything Simon has kind of put forth? If you don't, let me know. If you do, great. Be sure to follow Simon as well. Where can they find you, Simon?
So I've got a website, simonmichaux.com, where I'm trying to put all my work up on. It's not perfect. I'm running it myself, so it's not a professional website as such. Come and find me there.
Excellent. We'll also have it in the description box below for those interested. And with that said, I will see you guys in the next episode. Bye, y'all.